Hey everybody, welcome back to part 2 of the textual criticism of the New Testament. Today we're going to be looking at the basics of early transmission of the New Testament text. I know I said that we were going to look at Kurt and Barbara Alon's book and how to identify and find manuscripts of the New Testament text, but I thought I'd save that till tomorrow and give a little bit more of an introduction to the transmission of the New Testament text. There's some basic information that Alon puts forth in the early chapters of his book that the text critic should keep in mind moving forward, practicing New Testament textual criticism. So I've taken a quote from page 67, something that we all need to keep in mind. New Testament textual criticism must always keep in mind and consider the implications of what has been learned from studies in the history of the canon and from early church history, if its conclusions are to be sound. And this is something that I think is extraordinarily important, and we've looked at it to some degree in the Old Testament text. You know, these things were not transmitted in a vacuum. And so understanding the time, the context, the historical period, is very important to understanding how the text was transmitted and in practicing textual criticism. So there are several things that he points out that we need to keep in mind, sort of benchmarks. One is by the second half of the 2nd century, the Gospels began to circulate as a collection. We noted that yesterday. And the pastoral letters were added to and began to circulate with the Pauline corpus. So this is in the second half of the 2nd century. But by the year 200, or around there, the New Testament began to be translated, or was being commonly translated, into other languages. So, in the West, the text was we have evidence, in the West, we have Latin manuscripts. In Egypt, we have manuscripts in Coptic. And in Syria, we have manuscripts in Syriac. Now, there's a question that they deal with in their book: was there a Western text type? By the year 200, the West was, for all intents and purposes, no longer a significant factor in the transmission of the New Testament text. And this was partly due to the fact that all of the influential theologians were in or from the East. So there were theologians that moved into the West, but these were from the East, and that there is not enough evidence to support a Western text type. And this is important moving forward, trying to understand the different families, the different text types, the different traditions from the first part of the first millennium CE. Understanding that the New Testament, when it was transmitted early on, was considered to some degree a living text is extremely important when we come to the variants that we see in the manuscripts. Until the beginning of the 4th century, unlike the Hebrew text, as we looked at in previous videos, the copyists felt free to correct and or improve upon the New Testament text or manuscripts as they saw fit and as they copied. Part of this was that they believed that they were filled with the Holy Spirit, which allowed them or afforded them this freedom. When we see the variation, it can very well be due to this living text idea. To balance that, there was a type of rigidity that was seen in the New Testament text. In these different text types, these different textual traditions, we see that there is a tendency for a particular reading, once it enters the textual tradition, to stay that way, to stay there. So the individual text types tended to keep their individual readings as they were transmitted.
You're almost done.
Almost done. Silly. Now we know that individuals, not scriptoria, were responsible for the transmission, the copying of these text types. By the way, I have Piper here. If you hear an apple crunching in the background, that's her.
I'm sleeping.
Yep. So individuals were responsible for copying the text. Now, Alon gives the example, the metaphor of individual centers of copying, centers of transmission. He likens them unto ripples in a pond, or a stone being thrown into a pond and creating ripples. As a text was copied in a particular area, the effects were transmitted out from that area. And when a text moved and was copied in another area in addition to that first area, it created its own ripples. And when the ripples overlapped with one another, there was an intermingling of text types, which makes it extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible, often to follow these text types back all the way. Finally, he notes that persecutions of Diocletian resulted in multitudes of manuscripts being destroyed, which had effects for later transmission. So, as promised, tomorrow I will try to give an introductory overview of how to use Alain's book to identify individual manuscripts of the New Testament. So stay with us. Come say goodbye.